everyone's got a video of him. You've, I guess, probably seen it, the one that did 4 million views in a weekend. Tall lad in a bearskin cap, standing his post outside the palace, jaw locked, eyes forward, while a group of tourists, 3 men, 2 women, matching lanyards from some corporate retreat in Swindon, circled him like he was a garden ornament. One of them got close enough to fog his cheek with breath. Another flicked the brass button on his tunic, just to hear the sound. Sort of, he didn't move. They laughed. The internet laughed. Someone captioned it, "Mannequin challenge but, make it embarrassing." Someone else said, "Why are we still funding this? He's basically a hat rack." The comments section was 100,000 people agreeing that this was the most pointless job in Britain. What the video didn't show was the 7 seconds before. It didn't show his eyes tracking the man in the grey jacket who'd moved off the designated tourist line and was now standing 11 feet from the sovereign entrance, an angle that wasn't curiosity. It didn't show the micro shift in his right shoulder. The way his fingers adjusted, just once, on the rifle. It didn't, I guess, show what he'd already decided to do, and when, and how. The tourists got their video, they got their likes. They went back to Swindon, and the man in the grey jacket, for reasons he probably told himself were his own idea, turned around and walked away. Nobody ever made a video about that. This is the story of what the tourists didn't see, and what it cost the man standing still to let them keep not seeing it. I'd been posted to the Palace Liaison Office for 11 days before I watched James Callow become a meme. I honestly wasn't supposed to be watching. I'd a desk, which had a backlog of incident cross-references that my superior, a compact, permanently disappointed Scotsman named DCI Renwick, had described as only slightly less urgent than your career. But the window in my office faced the front perimeter, and at 2:17 on a Tuesday in September, with the tourist line swollen past their cordons and the light doing that specific September thing where it turned everything the color of old brass, I happened to look up. He was easy to pick out even among the other guards. Something about the way he stood. Not stiffer than the rest. Stiller, and the others held their posts like men holding themselves in place. Callow held his like the post was simply where he'd chosen to be, and would choose again, and wasn't being tested by the question. I knew his file by then, and everyone in the building knew his file by then, though for different reasons. In my opinion, 26 years old. Joined the Grenadier Guards at 18 after a very specific sort of adolescence in Wolverhampton, the kind. The file listed, as complex family circumstances in the way files do when they mean worse than that. 2 tours. One in a theater I'm not permitted to name, and one in Afghanistan's Helmand province, the second of which had produced a medical review, a commendation, and a 14-month gap in his service record that his current CO referred to as a period of reassessment. His psych clearance had come back green. His reassignment to ceremonial duties had come with a note from someone senior enough that Renwick went quiet when he read it, which was the first time I'd ever seen Renwick go quiet. The unofficial verdict among the duty officers was simpler. They've put a live one in dress uniform and called it ceremonial. I was still forming my own opinion when the tourists arrived. There were 5 of them. Corporate, I thought, the matching lanyards, the slight entitlement of people who'd expensed the trip and, therefore, felt the city owed them something. They moved along the line the way people do when they've already decided the experience is disappointing, taking photos of things they'd already decided were worth photographing and ignoring the things that weren't in the brochure. They reached Callow's post at 2:23. The first one pointed a phone at him. Standard, and fine. For what it's worth, Callow's eyes didn't move. The second one got closer than the guideline sign suggested. Basically, also standard, technically. Humans testing the boundary, which is an instinct so ingrained it apparently survives international travel and corporate away days. Callow's eyes didn't move. The third sort of one, the largest, red-faced, the kind of confidence that came from a particular kind of English school, said something to the others, and they laughed, and he moved forward and flicked the brass button on Callow's tunic. Flicked it. Like it was, a light switch. Like it was a game. Plus, I was already reaching for the radio. Actually, I stopped. Because Callow's eyes had moved. Not to the man who'd touched him. plus, to the left. To a gray jacket, maybe 35 years old, nondescript in the specific way that occasionally means something and usually means nothing, who had stepped off the tourist line and was now standing at a particular angle to the sovereign entrance gate. Standing still and well, a crowd of people who were all moving. Heads slightly down. Phone out, well, but not raised. I've been in this work long enough to know that most people who stand like that aren't thing. Lost, distracted, in the middle of a text message. The ratio of threat to innocent in any given crowd outside a royal residence runs somewhere north of 1,000 to 1, and the 1,000 is almost always right. But Callow had clocked him at 11 feet in the middle of being publicly humiliated by a man flicking his buttons. I think, part of my brain that I try to keep quiet and professional sat up and went, oh. What happened next took 40 seconds. I watched Callow absorb the continued performance of the tourists, another phone, another flick, someone else's hand briefly on his shoulder without a single visible response. His eyes cycled the perimeter. They came back to the gray jacket. They moved again. They came back. His right shoulder shifted. Barely, and less than a degree. His fingers adjusted on the rifle. One repositioning. A microcheck, the kind a person does when they're not touching a thing but reminding themselves exactly where it's. The gray jacket looked up. I don't know what he saw, which Callow's face hadn't changed. His eyes were forward again, locked and ceremonial and utterly vacated of expression. He looked, from any camera angle, like a man doing absolutely nothing. The gray jacket pocketed his phone. He looked at the entrance gate once more. Then, he looked at Callow. I couldn't see his face from my window, but the angle of his head said he was looking at Callow, specifically, not at the entrance, not at the tourists, and something in his posture shifted the way postures shift when a calculation has just come back wrong. He turned around. He walked back into the crowd and was gone in 30 seconds. The tourists, oblivious, finished their performance and moved on. The video they'd made, I saw it 2 hours later, captioned Mannequin Challenge but make it embarrassing, was already climbing its way towards something viral. Comments about wasted tax money. Comments about pointless traditions. 100,000 people in confident agreement about a job they'd never done, protecting a building they'd never been responsible for, watching a man they'd decided was furniture. I sat at my desk for a long time after that. Renwick came through the office at 4 o'clock, dropped a new set of incident files in front of me, and said, without looking up, Callow's post report from today. Flag anything of interest. I looked at the report. Post quiet. Pretty much, no incidents. Tourists within standard behavioral parameters. Nothing unusual to report, and I read it twice. I thought about the gray jacket. About the 11 feet. About the shoulder that shifted less than a degree and the fingers that moved once and the eyes that came back to the same point until the point turned around and decided somewhere else was better. I thought about the word mannequin and what it costs a person to let it sit on them like weather. I flagged nothing. I closed the file. And I started trying to find out who the gray jacket was. The look, gray jacket had a name by Thursday morning. Renwick delivered it the way he delivered everything, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement. That I guess, it was significant, sliding the printed sheet across my desk like a grocery receipt. I read it, and I read it again. I put it face down. Where did this, I think, come from? I asked. Stop asking questions that have answers you won't like, Renwick said, and walked out. The name on the sheet was Varnon. TBH, that was enough. That was, frankly, more than enough. A thread that, if you pulled it, ran through 3 open intelligence files, 2 closed ones, and an incident in Brussels 14 months ago that I technically wasn't supposed to know about and definitely wasn't supposed to have read while Renwick was at lunch and his terminal was still unlocked. Varnon was the kind of man who didn't come to a location unless that location was the point. Which meant that whatever Callow had redirected on Tuesday afternoon hadn't been paranoia. It had been correct. I spent Thursday building the case for escalation. I spent Thursday evening being told, by 3 different people in ascending order of seniority, that the incident hadn't been an incident because nothing had happened, and things that hadn't happened couldn't be escalated, and perhaps I might focus on the very real and very present backlog of incidents that had happened, and was I aware that my 6-month review was coming up? I was aware. I went back to the window. Plus, Calla was on the Saturday rotation, which meant I'd Friday to think about what I knew and what I couldn't prove and what the gap between those two things meant in practical terms. I used it poorly, and I made a list. I stared at the list. I added Varnon's name to the top in block letters and then crossed it out. Because writing it down felt like doing something about it, and I wasn't doing something about it, and I didn't want to confuse the two. At 11 on Friday night I went to the staff canteen, which was empty except for a duty sergeant named Okafor who was eating a sandwich with the commitment of a man who had decided this was the most important sandwich he'd ever had, and James Callow, in civilian clothes, sitting at the far table with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, watching the door. He looked different without the uniform. Younger, which N.T. expected, the bearskin cap and the scarlet added 10 years of severity. Without them he was just a lean, pale young man from Wolverhampton with slightly too many old scars on his forearms. The specific quality of stillness you only get from practicing it as a survival strategy. He clocked me in the doorway, and he didn't look away. I got a tea I didn't want and sat down across from him, because I'd run out of reasons not to. Because, and this is the part I've been quite squared with my own professional self-image, I wanted to know if he was alright. You saw the video, he said. Not a question, yes. My mum sent it to me. A pause. She thought it was funny. I didn't know what to do with that, so I put it down somewhere and moved past it. I saw you clock Varnon. Nothing changed in his face. The stillness was the same, the post-stillness, I realized, the hold your post-stillness, but there was something different behind it now, something less managed. Didn't know sort of, his name, he said. Knew what he was. How? He thought about this with the seriousness of someone who didn't answer questions carelessly. You learn what wrong looks like, he said. You spend long enough in places where the wrong thing will kill you, you stop noticing the right things and start noticing the gaps in them. He was standing still in a crowd. His hands were wrong. The way pretty much, he was looking at the gate, not at the building, not at the tourists, at the gate itself. That's not a tourist. That's geometry. Geometry. Working out angles and distance. What's between him and the target? He picked up his tea. Look, didn't drink it. We had a name for it, which in Helmand. Reading the ground. You'd come into a village and you'd walk through it and the ground would be wrong or right and you'd know it before you knew why you knew it. Something moved across his face. Not pain exactly. More like the memory of pain, which is a different and, in some ways, worse thing. Usually you, for what it's worth, had time to act on it. Sometimes you didn't. I thought about the 14-month gap in his service record. I didn't ask. I flagged nothing in my post report, I said. My superiors won't move on it. Plus, officially Tuesday was a quiet afternoon. He looked at me for the first time the way a person looks at you when they're deciding whether you're worth a certain kind of honesty. I seemed to pass some threshold I wasn't aware of. Course it was, he said. That doesn't bother you? He set the tea down. Everything I sort of did on Tuesday I did in the middle of being filmed making a fool of myself for the internet. The result was that a man who shouldn't have been where he was decided to be somewhere else. No paperwork. No incident, and no report. He met my eyes. That's the job, isn't it? If to be fair, it works, nothing happens. Plus, if nothing happens, there's nothing to show. There's no metric for the thing that didn't occur. I sat with that. There was a logic to it that made something in my chest feel like a small structural failure. 11 I guess, days into my posting, I was already trying to build a system for tracking threats that hadn't materialized because a 26-year-old from Wolverhampton had redirected them through sheer trained perception while a corporate retreat from Swindon made content about what a waste he was. The video's at 6 million now, I said, for no good reason. 7. He said it without any particular bitterness. Mum updates me. Does it? I stopped. To be fair, rephrased. The button, which I mean, the things they said. He was quiet long enough that I thought I'd lost him. Well, then, there's a technique. You go somewhere else. Not checked out, you're still watching, still reading, still doing the job. But, the surface of you goes somewhere else so the noise slides off it. A pause. I guess, you learn it. Or you don't last. Where do you go? He picked up his tea. Drank it this time, which cold, by now he didn't react. Basically, doesn't matter, he said. And, the way he said it told me it mattered very much, and, was the one thing in the entire conversation he wasn't going to give me, and, that was fine, and, I shouldn't push, and, I didn't. I went back to my desk at midnight and, reopened the Varnon file. Somewhere in the building, 2 floors down and, across a courtyard I could see. From my window if I craned, a lamp was still on in the duty office. I think, watched it for a while. I thought about geometry, about angles and distance and what's between a man and his target. About a metric for things that don't occur. About a gap in a service record that nobody was going to explain to me, and the specific quality of a young man's stillness, and the word technique, and where you go when the noise is coming at you and you need the surface of yourself to be somewhere it can't land. The lamp stayed on. I'd a very long list to build. Varnon came back on a Wednesday. Not to the front perimeter. That look would have been stupid, and the one thing every file agreed on was that Varnon wasn't stupid. He came through the East Service entrance, which required a contractor credential that had cleared its 3-tier verification 11 days ago, before I'd known his name, before Tuesday's post report had been written and buried, before the 7 million view video had finished cycling through its cultural moment and started its slow slide toward forgotten. I found out at 6:44 a.m. plus, from a text message I wasn't supposed to receive, from a source I'm not going to name, containing 4 words and a building schematic. Well, he's inside. East Wing. I'd my jacket basically on before I finished reading. The duty corridor look was 12 seconds from my office at a walk. 6 at something I told myself was a brisk professional pace and was actually a run. I hit the first checkpoint at 6:46 and found a Coldstream guard named Briggs looking confused at a screen and a senior officer named Hartwell looking at his phone with the expression of a man who had just been handed a problem he didn't want to hold. East Wing, I said, which we're aware, Hartwell said. Stand down. It's being handled. By whom? He looked at me the way senior officers look at people whose 6-month reviews are coming up. Stand down. I stood down. I went back toward my office and, then, I didn't. I went sideways instead, through the maintenance corridor off the main gallery, which I knew because I'd spent 2 evenings this week walking the building's sightlines with the building schematic and a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and the specific paranoid energy of someone who'd been told 3 times that nothing was happening and was increasingly certain that something was. The for what it's worth, East Wing Gallery was a long room of equestrian portraits that smelled of beeswax and old carpet and the particular institutional quiet of a space that tourists move through too fast to actually hear. There was 1 guard post at the far entrance. Ceremonial, technically bearskin, scarlet, rifle at the prescribed angle. The post rotations had been reshuffled twice this week due to a flu going through the duty roster. Callow had the East Gallery. I came through the maintenance door at the south end and stopped. The room was the length of a cricket pitch. Callow was at the north end, at his post, rifle at angle, eyes forward. Equestrian portraits on both sides. The morning, in my opinion, light through the high windows was the color of old bone. Varnon was at the midpoint. Not moving. Not in my opinion, looking at the portraits. Standing with his back to the east wall, which meant his back was covered and he had sightlines in 3 directions, with a phone in one hand and the other hand inside his jacket in a way that coats didn't usually hang. 11 feet, I thought, and the thought was half memory, Callow's voice from the canteen, not a tourist. That's geometry. I counted the distance between them. 40 feet, and maybe 45. Long enough for one version of this. Short enough for another. What I noticed, what I'll think about for a very long time, in the ways that specific moments have a way of insisting on being thought about, was that Callow had already noticed him. He couldn't haven't noticed him. The room had one door Varnon could have used and Callow was standing 12 feet from it and had been standing there since 6 o'clock. He'd watched the man walk in. He'd watched him take position. He was watching him now with his eyes fixed at ceremonial forward and his face doing its managed blankness and his fingers doing the micro-adjustment I'd seen on Tuesday, the one that was less than a degree and meant everything. Like, Varnon hadn't moved. Callow hadn't moved. And I was standing 30 feet behind Varnon in a maintenance doorway with no radio and no weapon and the sudden vivid understanding that I'd made a series of decisions across the last week that had brought me here, to this room, to this morning, and none of them had included a plan for what happened next. My phone was in my jacket. I could call it in 40 seconds minimum for response, more likely 90. The building's east wing was not a fast corridor for anyone coming from the main checkpoint. I watched Varnon's hand inside his jacket. I watched Callow's fingers on the rifle. I thought about the canteen. Plus, about going somewhere else so the noise slides off the surface of you. About the technique. About a 14-month gap in a service record and a young man who watched a crowd the way other people watch nothing, who had grown up in a household the file called complex circumstances, who had been to a place in Hellman and come back from it with a very particular education in what wrong looks like from the inside. Varnon took a step toward the north end of the gallery. Toward Callow. And Callow's eyes moved. Not to Varnon. Not forward. To me. Directly to me, through 30 feet of equestrian portraiture and old carpet smell and bone-colored morning light, with an expression that was not the post expression and not the canteen expression but something else, something stripped back to its studs, clear and fast and entirely without the managed surface. He'd known I was here. He'd known before I'd known I was going to be here. Filed it, the way he filed the geometry, the way he filed the gray jacket on Tuesday. And now he was looking at me in 1 second, barely one, and the look said something I parsed entirely without language, the way you sometimes do with people who have trained themselves down to the essential. Stay, which don't. I've this. Varnon stopped. He looked honestly at the portrait nearest to him, a man on a dark horse, face composed into the permanent confidence of someone painted at the height of their importance, and then he looked at Callow, and then he looked back at the portrait, and some calculation moved through him that I could see from behind and couldn't read from behind, and that resolved, after 4 seconds, into him turning toward the east door. Not running. Walking. The particular walk of a man revising a decision. He was gone in 30 seconds. The room settled back into beeswax and quiet. Callow's eyes went forward. His fingers stilled. He became, pretty much, in the space of a breath, the post again, scarlet and bearskin and prescribed rifle angle and the face tourists filmed because it looked like nobody was home. I stood, in my opinion, in the maintenance doorway for a long time. I thought about what I'd witnessed and what it would look like in a report and what a report about it would produce. I thought about Hartwell saying stand down and the 3 conversations about things that hadn't happened. I thought about Renwick's face when he'd read the senior note in Callow's file, the going quiet, the thing Renwick didn't do. I thought about Varnon's hand inside his jacket and the 4 seconds of recalculation and what had been in those 4 seconds that had shifted the outcome. Whether it was Callow's stillness. Whether it was me in the doorway, an unexpected variable. Whether Varnon had simply decided the geometry was wrong today. Whether he'd be back when the geometry was right. I went back to my office. I opened a new document. I wrote the date and the time and East Gallery, witness account at the top, and then I sat for a while looking at the words. My 6-month review was in 3 weeks. I started writing. Outside, on the front perimeter, the first tourist group of the morning was assembling at the cordons with their phones out. One of them had already found the video. I could hear the audio faintly through the glass, the laughter, the button flick, the caption someone had read aloud. Mannequin challenge, but make it embarrassing. I kept writing.